Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you on this Thursday. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, invite other folks into this conversation. This is going to be, as one comrade said, this will be one for the ages, and I think that they are right. Really looking forward to this discussion with Franck Magennis about his work, which I think is an inspiration for all of us in these dark times, and really demonstrates the kind of work that especially people within the legal realm can do, but I think also will provide us hopefully with some great analysis and understanding of the situation that we find ourselves in, which is obviously extremely dire and horrific for people in Gaza right now. But all is not lost, and we need to keep focus on what we can do and what we can control, and keep our analysis steady and our you know move forward as best we can. So let me just introduce our guests so that we can get in it. We have about 90 minutes today, so we're welcoming Barrister Frank Magennis, who is a barrister with Garden Court Chambers and a member of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. I'm going to let him come on and kind of do a further introduction because I imagine, his work has evolved quite a bit over the years and since some of these bios probably came out, and, especially with the needs of the folks he's been working with since October 7th. So, Frank, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you so much for having me, comrade. It's a real privilege and an honor to share this space with you.
Likewise. So I know many folks, I think, have become familiar with your work and with some of your interviews. You did a great interview that many of us saw a few months ago on Electronic Intifada, which, of course, is kind of a weekly lifeline for so many of us. And of course, you've been involved in some, quite high-profile cases as well, which we'll talk about. I know that there's some of it we can't get into because if you're still awaiting judgment on some of these, you can't, comment on them directly. But you've also somebody who's been involved in pro-Palestine work for quite some time, and specifically work in the legal arena. So since it's your first time here with us, could you just take a few minutes and share a little bit about yourself and your work before we get into the discussion?
Absolutely. So yeah, my name's Franck Magennis, and I'm a communist. I originally come from the occupied 6 counties in the north of Ireland, but for the last 9 years, I've been practicing as a lawyer, called to the bar of England and Wales in 2016, and I would say I sort of try to describe myself as a communist first and a lawyer second, and that's something we can sort of get into. I think that there's a trap of conceiving of yourself identifying too closely with your job. I think that what's far more important than the job that people do is the politics that they choose. So I sort of went on a certain political journey, and again, maybe that's something we can get into later, right? How do people arrive at the politics that they do? I would say that the short version of the story of how I arrived at my communist politics starts with Irish republicanism. I think some of my earliest memories were of my father explaining the nature of the Irish struggle against British colonialism, explaining to me, like when I was like 4 or 5 years old, that part of Ireland was occupied. And then you can't grow up in somewhere like the occupied north of Ireland without taking a political position, right? You just don't have that luxury. The politics is so sharply divided between the colonizer and the colonized, and your attitude towards the colonial project that you're sort of at a very young age forced to take positions. And so I would say that I came to England to study when I was a teenager, did my undergraduate degree in London, and I had this kind of, I would say, like romantic bourgeois Irish nationalist set of politics, right? I sort of hated the British Empire that had colonized me, but my politics didn't go much beyond that. And then because the so-called troubles had more or less been resolved by the time I was coming of age, the Palestinian struggle really sort of appealed to my sense of, anti-colonial instincts that had come from growing up in Ireland. And then it was through engaging very actively in my undergraduate with pro-Palestine solidarity work that I encountered a lot of people who I still consider very close friends and comrades today, and it's almost like they sort of taught me my communism, right? I remember in particular one comrade turning me on to Rosa Luxemburg, right, reformer revolution, and really sitting with that. And like, I'm really grateful to the various comrades, and I think specifically the fact that so many of the people who showed me, challenged my politics, and showed me, I would say, a more satisfying communist, anti-capitalist, Marxist critique. The fact that so many of those people were English sort of led me to a much less parochial, I would say, much less kind of identitarian understanding of politics, and it led me to a far more satisfying, satisfying politics that I have today. But obviously, the journey is never really over. I'm still on this political journey, and we all are. And then, as to my legal practice, like, I think I want to frame things. I'm trying to frame things. I've been thinking a lot recently about Paulo Freire and what he says about student-teacher. Like the need to dissolve that relationship. And so I'm really wary about presenting myself as a lawyer. And again, maybe something we can get into is that I really think that we should conceive of ourselves as lawyers, like as a, the workers' movement, the communist movement, the anti-capitalist movement, the anti-imperialist movement. I think it's vital for us to interrogate this notion of a distinction between a lawyer and not lawyer. I think it's quite problematic. We should interrogate it. But obviously, there is a material reality to being a so-called qualified lawyer. There are certain kind of practical privileges that flow from that, right? I can go and address certain courts. I have a certain skill set, certain knowledge. I spend my time doing certain things. And on that note, since October 7th, 2023, I already had a focus on Palestine. A lot of my cases already touched on Palestine. I had represented an anti-Zionist Jewish guy who didn't want to serve in the Israeli military. He had claimed asylum. That was 4 years ago. So before October 2023, I was already engaged in Palestinian struggle, and I had worked in Palestine for an NGO for 3 months in 2019. But it's really since October 2023 that the focus of my legal activity has pivoted considerably towards Palestine, and I would say about 75-80% of my cases now directly touch on attempts to challenge Zionism in court, whether that's representing people who've been fired from their jobs for criticizing the fascist ideology of Zionism on social media or at work. A lot of people getting hauled in front of their professional regulators, right? So I'm representing doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers who get dragged in front of professional regulators and told that their right to practice as a professional should be called into question because of the ways that they've criticized the apartheid state of Israel while it commits a genocide. I'm engaged in some ambitious kind of so-called public law challenges. So we're trying to challenge local government, local authorities, and think about the way that they are directly complicit in this project. I'm also involved in a specific project to try and bring prosecutions against British citizens who stand accused of joining the Israeli military and committing war crimes, crimes against humanity. And I'm increasingly being dragged back into doing criminal defense because so much of what the movement needs right now is, I would say, principled anti-Zionist lawyers who are willing to go into court and properly defend people accused of crimes in relation to their pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist advocacy. And I would say that the climate in Britain is particularly difficult in that regard, specifically in the criminal courts. There has been a concerted attempt by the British establishment to try to strip away the defenses that used to be available and to inhibit the room of anti-Zionist defendants to maneuver. So I hope that's not too lengthy. That's a rough and ready introduction to who I am. A communist first, a lawyer second, and working on those kinds of cases.
Much appreciated. That's great. Somebody did ask what professional regulators are. Could you just say a little bit? I mean, I imagine this is something like both like bar associations, professional associations, as well as like within certain jobs, there are like ethical codes and standards that, get used to try to say you can't do certain things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, a doctor has certain professional obligations that they have to observe. And if they don't observe them, they can be subject to what's really a kind of prosecution. It's a kind of non-criminal prosecution where their regulator, right, their professional regulator, in the case of doctors, it's the GMC, right, the General Medical Council, can bring a case against them saying you have breached your obligations in XYZ way. And really, it's supposed to be, well, I mean, it's somewhat complicated, but for the sake of simplicity, what's clear is that if a doctor is negligent, if a doctor is doing surgery and they keep failing to do the surgery to the requisite standard and keeps killing people, there should be a process by which the regulator steps in and says, you can't keep doing this. You're in breach of your professional obligations. But what tends to happen is, those obligations include stuff like don't be racist. And then what often happens is, a doctor will take to Twitter to say, like, in my opinion, Israel's an apartheid state and it's massacring Palestinians because they're not Jewish, or say any of the many things that we've seen people say on Twitter, and then they get dragged in front of the regulator for that kind of activity and told, you shouldn't be allowed to practice in whatever profession. So the regulators are things like GMC, General Medical Council, the BSB, which regulates barristers, right? In England, we have this bizarre split profession, two flavors of lawyer, right? Barrister and solicitor. So the Bar Standards Board regulates barristers, the Solicitors Regulation Authority regulates solicitors. There's something called the TRA, which regulates teachers. It's that sort of regulator. And the cases I'm involved with tend to involve people criticizing Israel and its governing ideology of Zionism on social media or internally to the workplace, and then often because of quite malicious organizations like UK Lawyers for Israel, so-called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, these anonymous harassing doxer accounts like Nasher Jew and Never Again 2020, I think one of them is called. So, I mean, we've all been out there on social media, right? It's clear that there's a very organized cohort of Zionist organizations and accounts that dox people. So it's that kind of thing. It's basically defending professionals against their regulator.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have all of our own flavors of this stuff in the United States, but it's the same, the same general game. So I want to go to that. You had this, again, that great interview with Electronic Intifada, and in it, you went through a description of Zionism as, in, to use your words in the interview, a terminal crisis. I know that you laid that case out quite well in that interview, so I encourage people, if they didn't see it, which I imagine they did, that they should check it out. But could you just talk about, again, kind of how you assess that and why you think it is a terminal crisis? Why is the crisis terminal, which is to say, could Zionism potentially recover from the position it's in? And how do you think about this?
Yeah, I just want to start by expressing my support for the comrades at Electronic Intifada. Just incredible, marathon, not a sprint. They're just there, every day, every week, trying to cast light on the reality of the genocide in circumstances where the mainstream media is obviously shamefully, actively complicit in it. So I can't thank them enough for giving me that space to try and contribute to the Palestinian struggle. This question of crisis is interesting. I am wary about saying Zionism is in terminal crisis. Sometimes I say that maybe out of frustration or something, and it's almost more of an expression of hope. It's to be hoped that Zionism is in terminal crisis. I think what's clear is that Zionism is in crisis. And then I think what avoids complacency is to then follow up by saying it is for us as anti-Zionists, in solidarity with Palestinians, to ensure that this is the terminal crisis of Zionism. And so, to be absolutely clear, I'm not here to predict the future. I don't know what the future holds. But it's clear that there's a very, very serious crisis in Zionism. It may be terminal, and if the anti-Zionist forces are sufficiently organized and pursue a sufficiently effective strategy, it's my hope and my belief that we can ensure that it's the terminal crisis of Zionism. But I'm not here to counsel complacency at all. The cost to Palestinians is just horrific, right? And again, I think it's important I think sometimes with lawyers, sometimes with Marxists, we're overly cerebral and we lose sight of how everyone's actually feeling. And I think it's okay to take a moment to just acknowledge how horrific this is. We in, outside of Palestine have spent 22 months, almost 2 years, watching a genocide unfold. It's completely horrific. It's I think it's broken something in all of us. I know that I have to compartmentalize just to keep going. It's I think it's like staring at the sun. If you look at the reality of the horror coming out of Gaza, then you just kind of break down. And I genuinely can't imagine what the people of Gaza are feeling right now. I try to. I have friends from Gaza, some of whom have escaped. It is really difficult, and I think it's vital that obviously we keep centering the reality of what Palestinians in Gaza are going through, and the fact that they're being targeted because of their race. Right, Zionism has always construed them as this racial threat So I'm trying to sit with that. I'm trying to sit with people's feelings, and I don't want to just blunder over them with some kind of cerebral analysis of here are the facts of Zionism and why it's in crisis. So with that, I guess, emotional groundwork in place, I do think there is cause for cautious optimism that this crisis could be terminal, but obviously it's coming at just obscene cost to Palestinians. And I think that's related. I think part of what's happening is the cost to Palestinians has become so obvious. The sheer nudity of Zionist racism, its genocidal character, is so obvious that that ordinary people on the street, even in a country like Britain or so-called United States, ordinary people are like just disgusted by it, right? Maybe previously the average person didn't follow Palestine very closely, or they were dimly aware that there was some kind of conflict, but they don't really follow it. I think a big part of the crisis is that Zionism's reputation is now, I think, permanently sullied. I think ordinary people on the street view them as like baby killing, hospital bombing, genocidal freaks. Like that's the long and short of it, right? So there's the kind of the opinion, the damage to common sense opinion, damage to Zionist reputation. But then there's the kind of the crisis can be, or our analysis of the crisis, I should say, can be split into a kind of principled Marxist materialist analysis, and then a kind of, we can look at the symptoms of it as they register in a more liberal way, right? So starting with the Marxist and the materialist, I just think you look at other anti-colonial struggles and they are defeated on the battlefield, but in a very asymmetrical way, right? And it's worth noting there's a very interesting, well-studied contrast between South Africa and Algeria. That tends to be the two reference points, right, for which strategy you're going to pursue. And South Africa was in some ways quite a limited strategy, right? And in some ways, the apartheid structure of South African apartheid remained in place after 1994. So, South Africa was defeated. It overextended itself. It tried to invade adjacent countries in the dying days of the apartheid regime, and it was defeated in part by Cuba sending troops to Angola and all the rest of it, right? And then, of course, in Algeria, the French faced an extremely sophisticated national liberation campaign in the form of the Front Libération Nationale and their strategy of just doing extreme damage to the colonizers until it became unsustainable. So the price being paid by Palestinians is horrific, but I think that serious damage has been done militarily. October 7th was a staggering loss for the Zionist entity, right? Like, they were humiliated. It's difficult to overstate just how humiliating it was, right? It's like they had trapped millions of people in a concentration camp and explicitly told them that they were subhuman and that they were a racial threat, and kind of micromanaged the number of calories getting in to sort of stage manage this horrific humanitarian crisis. And they thought that, Zionists thought that they could somehow maintain that intolerable situation indefinitely because they had allowed themselves to imagine that Palestinians aren't human. And October 7th did serious damage to the sort of Zionist reputation for military prowess. And then I think you fast forward to what's happened with Iran, and obviously the situation there is very liminal. But clearly, the fact that so many of those Iranian ballistic missiles struck their target, hit Haifa, hit Tel Aviv, so many people had to run into bunkers. I mean, again, this is anecdotal, but there was that astonishing back and forth between Betar USA, the Twitter handle, which is a fascist group, right, founded by Jabotinsky, and they were saying, because Mamdani had won the nomination, we encourage all Jews to flee New York. And a Jewish person had responded and said, "You first," or something like that. And then Betar USA said, "We're in Israel." So, like, you can just see part of the terminal crisis is that there's this myth that, Israel exists to keep Jews safe, which is obviously nonsense. Israel exists to advance first the British Empire, then the French Empire, and now the US Empire and NATO. It advances their interests in the region. It does it in an extremely racist and anti-Semitic way, frankly. And yet there's this kind of ideological gloss that says, no, it's about keeping Jews safe. That gloss is just being hammered because you've got a guy in a bomb shelter saying you need to flee New York, come to Israel where you'll be safe, and it's just obviously absurd, right? So the coherence of the Zionist claim is falling apart, and then I think on the liberal front, I think some of that's obvious, and I touched on this in the Electronic Intifada interview, and I think anyone who's following this understands the sort of liberal morbid symptoms. just whistling through them. The ICC has issued arrest warrants. That's an astonishing development, right? Obviously, the US has not ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but the UK has, France has, like all of these allies of the Zionist entity are now legally obliged to arrest its sitting prime minister, right? That's staggering. The ICJ has been helpful. South Africa clearly, and now various EU governments accusing the Zionist entity of genocide, and perhaps more importantly, in some ways, it's confirmed in July last year that it's apartheid. I just don't see how, as a matter of liberal international legality, domestic legality, Israel can come back from that. It's an indelible stain. It is now an apartheid state, and it seems likely it will go the way of South Africa. But again, you can't be complacent. It may be that we're witnessing the emergence of 21st century muscular fascism, and that Israel will be the kind of the cutting edge of that. So I just want to sort of round off my answer by, I've talked about the Marxist, like Zionism will be defeated on the battlefield, and I think it has suffered an astonishing series of military defeats. And just specifically with the Iranian example, what was so clear was that in a one-to-one conflict between Iran and Israel couldn't win a war of attrition, right? It was going to lose, and it needed to rely on its imperial patron in the form of the US to directly attack Iran. And everyone saw that. Anyone's paying attention could see that. But I just think I would encourage your listeners to think about fascism, the very rich tradition on the Marxist left, the radical left, of thinking about what is fascism. I've just got Alberto Toscano's book on late fascism. I'm looking forward to reading that. I think more work could be done on specifically thinking about what is Zionism, and therefore understanding more deeply what it means for an ideology to enter into a crisis. Certainly it's racist and colonial. I think that there is an argument to be said that it has always been a fascist ideology. Certainly there's an argument to be had that it's morphed into fascism. We know that the Zionist entity is currently governed by fascists. And so I would encourage comrades, I'm sure there is work on this, and I don't claim to be following it as closely as I might wish, but I do think there's value to going into court and making this argument, saying this is fascist, and then getting really thoughtful experts. Like I keep trying to find a way, and I hope we will soon, to get our mutual friend Alana Lentin to be an expert witness in one of my cases, to come and just say, like, look, there's an argument that this is what we mean by fascism. There's an argument to be had that Zionism is an inherently fascist ideology. I just think that's good praxis. And then, so fascism is the first thing I'd encourage us to think about. And then the second thing is ideology, right? Like there's this really rich Marxist tradition of thinking about what do we mean by ideology, right? You've got obviously Marx's essay on the German ideology, Althusser. I know he's controversial, but he has this interesting things to say about ideology as this material phenomenon, right? Like it's almost institutionalized. Like he talks about schools, I think, like how do you even conceptualize what a school is, right? It's this material social phenomenon that creates subject. It's not just that ideology is some kind of false set of ideas. Like we all are necessarily caught in ideology. There's no way to escape it. And all you can do is interrogate it from the inside. And I haven't seen too much work specifically marrying the Marxist critique of ideology with a critique of Zionism. I'm sure it exists. I'm really not here to sort of snipe from the sidelines. Like one of my objections about being a lawyer is that I don't get enough time to engage with theory as I might like. But it seems to me that like we have this very powerful critique of ideology, and you can just see the institutional codification of Zionism coming unstuck. You can see that in all kinds of ways. I could talk about it all day, but broadly, just to summarize, it's definitely in crisis. Zionism is definitely in crisis. Morbid symptoms everywhere. But I'm not here to say it is a terminal crisis. I am here to say we must make it Zionism's terminal crisis.
What are some of the ways you think that we do that? I mean, there's obviously a lot of different ways that, I know that you're not here to prescribe the whole, prescription here, but, what is your thoughts on that?
I think, if nothing else, thinking in terms of strategy. So I think that's true of the radical left, and I think it's true of qualified lawyers in court cases. So a lot of the time, I don't want to be too sassy about my liberal colleagues, but liberals like to talk about strategic litigation. And in my experience, most liberals don't really have a strategy even when they're doing so-called strategic litigation. And if they do, it's a deeply unsatisfying liberal strategy, which is kind of like more of the same. It's like, oh, the world is basically fine the way it is, and we just need to administer it more diligently, and stuff will be fine. So they just go into court and they talk about the rule of law, maybe. They're like, oh, we should just administer the law more accurately or something, which, as an Irish Republican, is absurd to me, right? It was the British Empire. It was perfectly legal what they did to colonize Ireland, right? There was no law per se being transgressed. And indeed, they wrote the laws, right? So I think as anti-capitalists, we should be much more critical, and we should actually think deeply about strategy. And again, like, we have this very rich tradition of trying to think about strategy. Lenin's whole strategic contribution, really, this idea that we need a vanguard party, that's a key strategic cleavage on the left still today, right? Like, do we need a vanguard party, or do we need something more horizontalist, whatever? Mike MacNair is obviously very influential. A lot of people reading him at the moment. His book on revolutionary strategy, like, really thorough Marxist analysis of, like, look, these are the decisions you have to make if you're serious about pursuing a strategy. And then, of course, the specifically kind of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist tradition. And again, Lenin looms very large there. So I think engaging with that strategic discourse is important. But if nothing else, like, we should have a strategy. And I think some of these groups don't have a proper strategy, and it would be good for us to try to think about what it would mean to have a proper strategy. I've said before that I'm quite influenced by a guy called Marshall Ganz, right, who has a book called Why David Sometimes Wins, in which he's talking about the successful attempt to organize so-called unorganizable migrant fruit pickers in the US. And he articulates this authoritative definition of strategy as being using what we have to get what we need to get what we want. And he goes into more detail. That's not all of it, but I find those three questions extremely clarifying. Or maybe you can ask a fourth question, like, who are we, right? So, like, who is the strategic agent to begin with? Let's think about what that is. And then let's ask ourselves, what do we have already? What are the resources we can already rely on? What are our actual goals? What do we want? And then what do we need as this kind of bridge between what we have and what we want? So if nothing else, I think, to answer your question, how do we do that? How do we defeat Zionism? The answer is with a strategy. In my opinion, like, I'm not based on the ground in Palestine, and I defer to the comrades in Palestine. Like, they will be the authors of their own liberation. And so it's for us, you might call it the diaspora, or those of us who are based outside of Palestine, it's for us to show critical solidarity to them as they attempt to enact their strategy. And, that's the broad political answer to the question, right? We need a strategy. I think we need to articulate it through collective vehicles. I'm a communist. I think that we should, like, the radical left in the West is in a state of fragmentation and impotence, but it seems to be Palestine that's actually leading to the revival of the radical left. Like, and before October 2023, there was no real movement. I think nothing big enough to constitute a movement existed, and it's Palestine, again at horrific cost, that's led to the reemergence of a powerful radical left. We can see that happening before our eyes. And then as to strategy specifically in court, I just think there's some timidity that's not matched by the wider movement. There's a lot of lawyers who haven't really understood the extent to which we already have this mass movement. And again, I've taken to quoting this or referencing, and I'm grateful to my friend Rob Knox, who's a formidable Marxist legal scholar, for introducing me to this guy, Jacques Vergès. So he was writing in the context of Algeria, French-occupied Algeria. And he pioneers this distinction between a sort of strategic cleavage that opposes itself in any legal strategy. Are you conniving with the existing legal regime, trying to win on its own terms, or are you provoking a rupture with it? And I'm here to suggest that the movement that defeats Zionism is already here. You can see it. It's extremely powerful. You can see it in Yemen. You can see it in Iran, certainly. You see it in some of the adjoining countries that neighbor the Zionist entity. But you can see it on the streets of a country like Britain, right? The belly of the beast. Look at polling in this country. I think something like 4-1. The ordinary people in this country, in Britain, favor expelling the Zionist entity from the United Nations, right? Public opinion has decisively shifted against Zionism, and there is a very, very increasingly militant movement that is willing to confront it. So I think the winning strategy, if nothing else, is, if I were to summarize it in a sentence, if you find yourself enacting a prior political strategy and you need the use of lawyers and you find yourself needing to go into court, in my opinion, the strategy is to use that as a pretext to cause maximum damage to Zionism. And we're at the point where we can provoke a rupture by going into the British Empire's own courts and more or less saying that explicitly, right? Literally addressing the judge and saying, my client is XYZ, it's a trade union, it's a militant direct action group, it's an individual criminal defendant, whoever it might be, going into court and just addressing the judge, addressing the jury if there is one, and just saying, we're here to do maximum damage to Zionism because it's a fascist ideology. And then ideally getting, a brilliant expert like Alana to come along and say, yeah, like without any moralism or like without trying to browbeat people, like it's fascist, it's obviously fascist, and just calmly saying that in court and making explicit that you're doing this meta rupture. You're saying like, well, the British Empire obviously supports Zionism. The Balfour Declaration 1917 is the most obvious manifestation of the fact that the British Empire has for more than a century supported the colonial project of racist mass murder known as Zionism. We in this case are here to do maximum damage to that ideology because it's an affront to humanity and it should be dismantled. You can just say that in court, but you have to have consciously adopted a strategy of saying, okay, if we were to go into this strange space that we call a courtroom, what would it mean for us to use that as a pretext for damaging Zionism as much as we can?
Yeah, appreciated. I really appreciated too how you kind of broke that down in your conversation with Nora and Asa on electronic intifada. I encourage people to check that out just to see. They talk about you cross-examining Zionist witnesses, for example, and you give an example of how that's done, which I think is good for folks to see. So let's talk a little bit about getting a little bit more into your politics. So, as we said, you're an anti-imperialist. You've talked about Marxism. You referenced socialism or barbarism again in that EI interview, and you've talked about Rosa Luxemburg and so on already. So for folks who are just disgusted by what they see in Gaza, right, which we all are. I mean, anybody who's looking is disgusted, including people on the right in the United States are disgusted, many of them, by it. The starvation, of course, the plight of children, all of this, but have not yet embraced, anti-imperialism or socialism or Marxism. How do you help make those necessary connections when you're having conversations with folks?
So the short answer is with difficulty, but I can break that down a bit. Like, I think we have to sort of interrogate that question a bit, right? Because again, with this Freirean approach, it can't be that we go to people and say, oh, your problem is you've not embraced socialism, you've not embraced anti-imperialism, right? Freire is saying we have to have a problem-posing dialogue. And in the case of speaking to Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians across Palestine and Palestinians in the diaspora, I don't think as the radical left we're in a position to sort of say to them, like, because obviously some Palestinians haven't embraced socialism. We're not in a position to say to them like, oh, well, the problem is you've not embraced this ideology, because they can legitimately turn around and say, your ideology is extremely weak. It never really recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the material force that's confronting Zionism on the ground today is not socialism, right? Now, I think I'm still a socialist, right? Like, I think that we should start from where we are. We don't make history and circumstances of our choosing, and the circumstances in which we find ourselves fighting Zionism is one in which the radical left is in a really poor state. Like I said, we're fragmented, we're weak, we have decades of, I would say, learned helplessness, right? That's specifically true in the case of Britain, right? Like this very militant industrial struggle that took place, the so-called miners' strike, right, with National Union of Mine Workers in 84, 85. So like 50 years ago, what is that, 40, it's 50 years ago now. And sorry, no, it's 40 years ago.
40 years.
Sorry, me. So 40 years ago. So it's our parents' generation who learned, like, you know what, you can fight as hard as you can against a neoliberal government and they can still smash you, right? So we have to start from that position. Like, we are very weak. But it's like I said, we sort of touched on my journey to communism. And I can answer this conversation, this question, or we can have this conversation in a number of ways. But I think that broadly, there's kind of, you might say there's 4 kind of conversations that you can have. And that's very rough and ready, right? That's not any kind of like theoretically rigorous scheme or whatever. But I'm just thinking about people in the West, and specifically Zionists. I'm not going to censor them, but I think part of our winning strategy is actually peeling people away from Zionism, right? And this is a tricky question. I don't have easy answers, but I think there's a certain part of the movement that sort of says, that homogenizes Zionists and then says they're all fascists. And I'm not sure that's right. I think that's overly simplistic. Actually, I agree that broadly Zionism is a fascist ideology, and that there are the kind of real card-carrying Barak Goldstein type people, right? Who obviously enacted a massacre in Hebron in 1994. Most of the ministers in the Zionist entity, they're clearly like openly fascist, right? But I just think it's wrong to suggest that people, certainly in the Jewish diaspora, are all like sort of consciously Zionist. I think there's a kind of common sense, in some ways quite thoughtless, commitment to Zionism because up until this point it had become so hegemonic within the Jewish diaspora. And I think that it is necessary for us to have conversations with people who are kind of on the fence and pointing out, as I have done previously, that like the fence doesn't exist anymore. There's no space for you to be like, oh, maybe I'm a Zionist. It's like we need to do that consciousness raising where we say, hey, for whatever reason, you've embraced a racist ideology. We are here to tell you that, you know, you have two options. Either you admit your mistake and join us fighting against Zionism, or you're our opponent and we'll fight you, right? So I think we have to pose that dilemma to Zionists because it's just good. It's good strategy. And I think it's bad to drive people who are clearly in crisis, right? Like you see this, just to pluck an example out of the air, the Board of Deputies of British Jews in Britain, explicitly Zionist organization, has been meeting with the war criminals who are enacting this genocide throughout. And it's in crisis. Like so-called Zionist members of its own board are saying, we can't hack this anymore. And they're resigning, saying, you're complicit in this genocide, right? So that's a crisis for Zionism. And we'd be stupid not to provoke that cleavage within the Zionist constituency, right, in the diaspora. So that's one. Then the second group is kind of what you might say, people who are committed to being pro-Palestinian, but they don't have principled anti-Zionist or principled anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist politics. I think with those people, there's a tricky thing, and Alana Lenton talks about this a lot, and other people, Assad Haider has some interesting things to say about identity. There's a whole conversation, a very important conversation about identity. And there's the kind of liberal understanding of identity, which is super individualist, super idealist. And then there's a Marxist understanding, which is materialist. So I think we have to have a Marxist materialist understanding of identity. And when you do, I just think it's more satisfying. And I was struck, I had a conversation with a Palestinian man. I was in Berlin recently, trying to do work with the comrades there. Like they're not doing very well. Germany is insane. And this Palestinian guy lives in Germany. And I'm really not here to lecture Palestinians at a moment when they're facing a genocide, right? Very, very difficult. But he was sort of saying to me, like, look, I'm just kind of looking out for my people, right? My people are facing a genocide. Like that's all I can really do. And I fully respect that. Fair enough. Like I can't imagine. Like I said, I really can't imagine. So I'm not here to tell him what he should do. But I do respect him enough to enter into a political dialogue with him. And I was sort of saying, like, well, okay, if we're going to do this national identity thing, like I'm Irish, or maybe I could complicate my identity a bit. French mother, live in London, whatever. But broadly, I'm some kind of Western European Irish guy, have an Irish passport. Like, why should I care about your people by that logic, right? I should just care about my people, right? And it's like, it was a provocation, but I was provoking him to be like, well, what does it mean for us to step into a more universalist politics? What does it mean for us to step into a politics that aims for the critique of the totality of global capitalist class relations, right? And then I suppose, well, I was going to break it down into 1, 2, 3, 4, but maybe that's an overly kind of like mechanistic way of doing it. I think that my personal journey, it's like when speaking to that Palestinian guy, it's like I'm speaking to a previous iteration of myself, where I could see a very similar kind of like, well, look, you know what? My country was colonized. My family has personally suffered because of the British colonization of Ireland in various violent ways. Like that's my fight. That's my struggle, and I'm sticking to that. And I came to London with those politics, and then something happened to make me sort of think, do you know what? Like, there's something slightly parochial about that. And I think the Palestinian struggle misses a trick if it doesn't notice the way that it is actually bound up in a global totality of imperial capitalist class relations. So again, just in terms of winning strategy, I think it's more satisfying to have a more accurate account of what's actually happening. And that for me is the Marxist critique of imperialism. I think that, again, I have all these academic friends, and they are much better at keeping up to date with the literature than I am for obvious reasons, right? And that's what, I think it's a problem for the movement that we have these extremely informed academics who are not necessarily able to put that theory into practice in the courtroom. And then we have these extremely busy, wonderful lawyers, but they don't have enough time to grapple with and operationalize the theory, right? So that's one of the things I'm trying to grapple with. But these academic friends of mine, they will understand the critique of imperialism much better than me. But I was very influenced in my thinking by this guy, John Smith, and his book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, right? Which is kind of in some ways just a lit review. It's about almost 10 years old now, so I need to read some more contemporary stuff, which I'm trying to do. But, he talks about this very persuasive review of the critique of imperialism. And it just helped me understand the world. It's one of the most important books I've ever read. It's just like the scales fell from my eyes, right? I was an immigration lawyer going into these courts, administering an extremely violent national border. And I was like, where does this come from? I just don't understand. I genuinely don't understand where this border actually comes from. I get the kind of unsatisfying liberal mystifying, like, oh, people are just different and they have to come from a country. And I was like, but this is so stupid. Like, nation states are such a recent invention. Even when they were invented, the national border is a much more recent invention. And so I just think the short answer of like, how do you bring people to our politics? How do you bring people to anti-imperialist politics? Is first of all by showing that it's theoretically rich, that it's like a more satisfying account of reality. Like, even if nothing else, even if we're impotent and all the rest of it, it would be better to really understand reality. But secondly, I think the challenge, which isn't really directed outwards to people that we're trying to bring in, it's directed internally. We have to criticize ourselves and understand, why is it that we're so weak? Why is it that, I was talking the other day about the international brigades. Like, where are the international brigades? Like, and that's not a moral criticism. It's an organizing problem. It's like, we should be sending brigades to fight against Zionist soldiers. We should be sufficiently organized and sufficiently powerful that we're in a position to do that. And we aren't. And we should ask ourselves, I don't have easy answers, but I think that's the starting point for the question is, what does it mean for us to make our solidarity more material and more powerful? And I suppose the final thing I'd say on this is about trauma. I think you got to be careful when you talk about trauma, because it's apt to re-traumatize people. But I think trauma is very interesting. Like, I certainly think that there have been times whenever I've tried to use my trauma as politics, like personal family trauma and all the rest of it. That's a real trap. And I think Zionism is almost like, I would say, Jewish Zionists, and in some ways non-Jewish Zionists, are almost addicted to wielding the trauma of the Holocaust, the undeniable trauma of the Holocaust, to justify an extremely narcissistic form of politics that blinds them to the trauma that they are currently enacting. And I think that that's worth dwelling on. And like, yeah, again, I don't have easy answers, but I think that having that honest conversation about, like, I think Che Guevara says this cliche quote about needing to be motivated by love. Like, I think Zionism, I think specifically German forms of Zionism, are very narcissistically bound up with this kind of obsession with yourself and your history and what your grandfather did in the Holocaust or whatever. And likewise, I think a lot of Jewish Zionists are like, the genocide that Jewish people experienced in the 1940s is so horrific that we are blind to the genocide that is currently being committed in the 2020s. Like, I just think the antidote to that is stepping outside of that extremely narcissistic way of living, and like refusing to lose sight of your fellow human, even and especially your enemies. And doing the difficult work of unpicking that trauma so that we can come out the other end with something much more peaceful. Like, I really think that has to be our politics on the left, even as we acknowledge that there is a time for violent self-defense, and that time is now.
Much appreciated. There's an episode actually of the East is a podcast that came out recently with a bunch of anti-Zionist Jews, where they're grappling with the history of Zionism. I'll put it in the show description because it also gets into a lot of these questions, including one of the folks who participates. I can't remember his name, but he currently lives in Germany and was born in the entity and is an anti-Zionist, Marxist, and really good on a lot of these questions that you're raising today. And also, I will put a plug too for folks. A recent collective that started up, a scholar collective called Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, which has a bunch of members that have been on this podcast: Max Isle, Louis Alday, Alex Avina, Charisse Burdenstelli, Matteo Capazzo, many, many, many others that we've done stuff with. I'm not going to name all of them, but folks will recognize. But really doing good work right now on these kind of questions. So in terms of marrying these strategic analyses, the thing I appreciate about them is that they're coming together and doing something collectively and naming their politics, and then doing scholarship to back up those politics. So in many ways, following a similar kind of trajectory, I think, that you're laying out in terms of how you approach your work as a barrister, as a lawyer, first approaching it from a political standpoint. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned that you're involved in some efforts to hold some British folks, British, I guess, folks who participated in the IDF who have British passports, I guess would be one way to put it, legally accountable for war crimes or crimes against America, crimes against humanity, not crimes against America. America would support those crimes, I guess, for what has been done in Gaza. Who else is doing this work? What are some ways that you see people approaching that struggle from a legal perspective? And, talk about the importance of this. I think this is really, really important part of the struggle, and about, again, like pushing for that terminal crisis of Zionism as well.
Absolutely. And this is I would say one of the most obvious morbid symptoms, right? Like, the Zionist entity is really strange. Like, you read that Law of Return 1950, every Jew may return to Israel as an Ole. Like, that's really strange. Like, countries don't do that. Like, you have like Australia and apartheid South African stuff, which try to do this policing of the boundary between white and black. But it's very, very rare to sort of say, like, we're going to gather this specific ethnicity from around the world, racialize them in that way, codify the racial distinction between Jew and not Jew, and then say that Jews are going to return here. And where is here? It's a colonial society that requires, as a matter of law, citizens to serve for 2 or 3 years in the military, depending on their gender, with some exceptions for Orthodox Jews and for Palestinian citizens of Israel, so-called, right? So part of the material basis by which the Zionist entity reproduces itself, the military basis for that colonial project, is that specific constitutional mechanism, right? Any Jew can return, and then when you do return, you have to serve in this military, right? So it's this hyper-racialized military, right? Like, some massive proportion of the soldiers who are currently enacting the genocide, which is broadly being enacted in the interest of the United States and its desire to maintain an unsinkable aircraft carrier, are Jewish, right? So if you create this crisis where you say, look, the countries where a lot of these recruits are coming from, like, if they're going to be prosecuted in those countries, that creates a problem. It creates a material problem for the ability of the Zionist military the Israeli military to reproduce itself. And so I think, again, taking a high-level strategic response to this question of, what is to be done about prosecuting people accused of war crimes, people accused of participating in this genocide, I think that we need a prior political strategy, and any legal tactics need to be subordinate to that strategy. And then there is this tricky question. Some abolitionists, some species of anarchist would say that attempting to prosecute people in that way is carceral, and I just think it's an interesting debate, but it seems to me that that's asking the people of Palestine to bear the weight of the revolutionary fantasies of people in the West who aren't being affected by genocide, right? I'm all for thinking about what a communist society might look like and how it might approach the question of interpersonal harm, and what it would mean to pursue the dismantling of institutions like the police and so on in some kind of transition to a better society. But you don't ask Palestinians to wait around for that, right? Like, as things stand, you explore the contradictions within the liberal legal state, and you try to get parts of the liberal state to attack other parts, and specifically you try to get parts of the liberal state to attack the fascist project of Zionism and this kind of fascist genocide that we're witnessing. So I'm relatively clear that, like, my sort of political conscience is clear. Like, we should absolutely prosecute Zionists because it causes a material problem for the Zionist entity as it commits a genocide. And so Hind Rajab Foundation is the cutting edge of this stuff. And I think, it's my understanding, they have a very sophisticated strategy. They're global. You can see it. Like, I constantly get their email updates and I see them on social media. Like, they're everywhere. And so, again, this is good stuff. Like, materially, it's not just a material fact that it's, I think, only a matter of time before we get a prosecution. We saw that there were 2 Israeli soldiers where, as I understand it, detained in Belgium, right, and questioned under some kind of universal jurisdiction law. Like that's a massive step forward. And you can see it's like the noose is tightening around Zionism, and it's tightening. It's being tightened by an increasingly coordinated network of activists, some of whom are legally qualified, all the rest of it, right? So I think that's important work. I think it's a kind of accountability. But I also think that it's not just that it operates at the level of the individual cases. It clearly has this knock-on effect on the image of Zionism, the ideology of Zionism. Magennis has this great quote in The General Theory of Law and Marxism, right? In the introduction, he talks about how there comes a time with any system of social relations where it enters into a crisis, where the ideology that mystifies those social relations can no longer fulfill that function. And so the social relations are laid bare. And I think that's what's happening with Zionism. I think people could kind of, before October 2023, they could kind of squint at it and be like, oh, the Holocaust was bad. This is a place where Jews could go to be safe. I guess that's fine. I won't think about it too much. I won't think about the Palestinians at all. I won't think about their suffering in the way that this is clearly colonial and it's extremely openly racist. All of that is melted away and everyone can see it. Like, oh, wow, this is like incredibly openly racist. And so it's not capable of defending itself. Zionism can't defend itself against the blows that are being directed at it. And one of those blows is, as the South African, I think it was the foreign minister, as South African minister, almost a year ago now, I think, said, if you're a dual national, South African Israeli dual national who served in that military during this genocide, we will arrest you. So it's like, you know, people in the diaspora, Jewish people in the Jewish diaspora who are thinking about availing themselves of this colonial right to return to Palestine and participate in the colonial project of Zionism and this specific genocide, they're going to think twice. It's just obvious. They're going to be like, wait, am I going to get arrested? Am I going to be remembered as a pariah and a war criminal if I do this? Like, that creates a ideological, reputational crisis for Zionism. And given the urgency of defeating the genocide, it's to be critically encouraged, in my opinion.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, as somebody who has talked to a lot of abolitionists over the years, you know, and has kind of grappled with that kind of question around, you know, is this carceral and stuff? I mean, the most clarifying experience for me was I was actually on a panel that included like Palestinian, you know, political prisoners and prisoner, you know, and, you know, I mean, it just like the notion that, you know, we would negate the ability of Palestinians to prosecute war crimes against their colonial captors. Like, I think it just clarifies so much the stakes of, you know, this kind of taking what is really a moral position against, you know, any engagement with, you know, using the carceral state, as opposed to, you know, looking at this strategically, as you're saying, in terms of, you know, can this be a part of how we provoke a crisis? Can we support Palestinians in holding people accountable? That absolutely should be, even if we don't think that ultimately, in the long run, this is the form of accountability that we want to see. We also don't want to see genocide. We don't want to see war crimes. We don't want to see crimes against humanity, right? And, you know, I don't think that we get to that world without some kind of strategic engagement around these issues. All right. So there's one of the things you mentioned this earlier of a kind of liberal understanding that, or framing that, you know, in my understanding, that would say see the law as like this almost end all be all, right? You know, thinking through, okay, the way that you engage in progress, right, is to pass laws, to secure rights, to vote, to win cases, and that along the way you kind of advance and improve your society this way. And you know, as Marxists, right, there's more of a perspective that would say, well, law is just the codification of existing power relations, right? And we, you know, we live in societies where we're ruled by the bourgeoisies or the capitalists, right? And so I think that in struggles for justice, also, of course, you know, we've long heard, even by people who are not from the Marxist tradition, that, you know, you have to struggle in ways often that involves the breaking of laws. It involves, you know, struggle by means that, of course, if you're struggling against you know, in the United States, just for an example, obviously our state is deeply Zionist and deeply imperialist, and it is so Zionist because U.S. imperialism is so central to the whole political economy of how our system works, right? And so, you know, they're not just Zionist because they like, you know, people in Israel, right? That's not the case. It's that they actually believe that, as horrific as everything that we see is, that it is still necessary to, you know, maintain their system. And so I'm curious about how you think about, you know, legal struggles within your framework. And we've talked about it some, so maybe there's just a couple of things that you would want to add. But, you know, how do you think more about the role of an anti-imperialist or Marxist lawyer, for example?
Yeah, I grapple with this quite a lot. And I think we need to grapple with it more collectively. But I think there's a few things, like this question of justice. And like, again, my thinking has been really informed by Rob Knox here. So Rob Knox has a brilliant essay that I think anyone who's trying to get qualified as a lawyer and wants to do useful movement work, anti-capitalist, communist, whatever, wants to contribute to the struggle, should read. I would encourage you to read Rob Knox's essay, Strategy and Tactics. So he talks about the run up to the Iraq War and how all of these people who call themselves Marxists, Marxist legal scholars, started writing these letters and stuff and saying this war would be illegal. And he was pointing out, like, well, hold on, you're appealing to the terrain of international law, which is a colonial construct. It's a bourgeois construct. So what is your strategy? According to what strategy? You can intervene on that terrain if you want to, but what was your strategy for just capitulating to the legal regime that you claim to be trying to obliterate, right? So I think that's a really useful provocation. And I heard him speak recently at Historical Materialism in Athens. And he was on point as ever. Like, I just find I go on this emotional journey as a practicing lawyer when I hear him talking. And it's like, he's riling me up because he's challenging me to think about the limits of what a single lawyer can do, what single cases can do. But then he never lapses into a kind of ultra-leftism. So I would say there are kind of three ways of thinking about this. There's the kind of naive left liberal way of thinking about it. Then there's the kind of overcorrection, a kind of ultra-leftist, certain kinds of anarchist, certain kind of ultra-leftist overcorrection. And then there's what I think is the correct position, which is to understand law from a Marxist materialist standpoint, right? So the first of those, and Duncan Kennedy talks about this in his essay, Legal Education as Training for Hierarchy, right? A very useful essay for people trying to get qualified as lawyers to read. And he articulates this naive liberal view. He sort of says, oh, a lot of people just think law is a good ideal, and if we just administer it more diligently, then a good society will basically result, right? So it's this kind of uncritical endorsement of bourgeois class relations. And then he contrasts that with a kind of a more critical understanding, which views law as enemy terrain, and you have to use the law against itself. Now, I think the ultra-leftist correction proceeds from, I would say, a vulgar critique of law that just sort of says the ruling class makes the rules. So we should just avoid the law somehow, because the law is this bad thing that's made by our enemies. And it's just not a proper, I think, satisfying account of socioeconomic reality. And it's not good strategy. It's not good theory. Because, to take an obvious example, like, you know, some of my best friends are syndicalists, all the rest of it. But these, like, a certain strand of thinking that says we should just join the trade union because the bourgeois state and the legislature that passes the laws, that's our enemy's terrain. We should go to our home terrain, which is the trade union and the struggle over the wage, the bread and butter economic struggle. And the obvious problem with that is that, like, look, you can't separate the economic struggle from the political struggle, right? You've got Kautsky saying the political struggle is the highest expression of the economic struggle, right? You have strikes and struggles over wages in individual workplaces, and then they aggregate, and then this political expression is the attempt to express the political interests of the entire class of people who are affected by being on one side of that class struggle between the owners of the means of production and the people who sell their labor power to those owners, right? So you can't just find your own home territory and just struggle there. Because first of all, that pure home territory doesn't exist. It's always penetrated by the state, and it's penetrated by our enemies, and it's always contradictory. But also, it's just a losing strategy. Like sometimes it's good to fight on enemy terrain. Sometimes it's useful to go behind enemy lines and to cause damage. Like, I mean, in some ways, what was October 7th, if not a foray behind enemy lines, right? It's a necessary site of struggle. You can't just disclaim it. You need to have an attitude towards it. That's true of courts, and it's true of parliament, right? And again, leaning on Lenin, I understand Lenin will divide opinion, but very thoughtful theoretician. And even if we disagree with some of what he said, we should engage with him, right? One of the most important thinkers of our tradition, in my opinion. And he talks specifically about the British Labour Party, right? That infamous letter where he says that comrades should support the Labour Party the way the rope supports the hanged man. So he wasn't saying, oh, just claim parliamentary struggle because it's nothing. He was saying enter into parliamentary struggle and use it as a site of conflict. Use it to advance your strategy. So I think we do need a proper understanding of the state. And I think that's lacking among a lot of so-called lawyers, qualified lawyers. I think we, again, on the Marxist left, we have this very rich tradition of understanding the state. I'm thinking in particular about what Marx says in Volume 1 of Capital, where he's talking about the Factory Acts. And he's not, like, Marx didn't disclaim struggle over that kind of legislation, right? That legislation that kind of put limits on the length of the working day and, you know, almost prevented this horrific bourgeois destruction of the golden goose that is the working class or whatever, right? So Marx was clear that, like, look, there's a struggle over legislation, and that is part of the site of struggle. And we get, obviously, Marx didn't fully get round to theorizing the state, but we get these glimpses of his theory of the state from things like Chapter 10. And then we have the more contemporary discussion, like Marxist theory around the state, Miliband, Poulantzas debate, all that kind of stuff. And then we also have this specific, I would say, much more sophisticated critique of law, right? The one that avoids this crude Marxist notion that the law is just the rules that were written by the ruling class. It's like, no, it's more than that. It's a site of struggle and it's complicated, right? So I'm thinking, again, Magennis, really useful theoretician, a general theory of law and Marxism, writing one side of Stalinism, right? He gets killed by Stalin. And so he's almost uses this cautionary tale, a very thoughtful Marxist theoretician of law, who's then, in some ways, some would say, killed by an unchecked executive authority of the Stalinist regime, that and under this Stalinist bureaucracy, law broke down entirely. And so you could just be accused of random crimes and there was no kind of rule of law. So that, and then the other side of Stalinism, we have, like chronologically, we have E.P. Thompson, writes this really interesting book, Whigs and Hunters, right? Thinking about the Black Act, which is this act of the British Parliament that seems to codify the emergence of new capitalist class relations. And he says, in the conclusion to that book, famously, right, the rule of law is an unqualified human good. So he's basically saying, in any complex society, certainly in a socialist or a communist society, we're going to need some kind of commitment to law. And then my thinking here has also been really informed by Nora Erekat, who is herself in dialogue with Rob Knox, right? She cites strategy and tactics in the introduction to her wonderful book, Justice for Some, where law and the question of Palestine. And I think that she's a brilliant person to read when trying to think about strategy. And the way she talks about the way that her Zionist enemies have used law in this very strategic way, and they've done legal work, which is a concept she borrows from Duncan Kennedy, right? So I do think this proper critique of the state and a proper critique of law that doesn't just reduce it to this bad thing that our enemies do, but actually it's a site of struggle, is really vital. And then in terms of what does it mean to be an imperialist, an anti-imperialist lawyer, a socialist lawyer? I actually think, and maybe we'll come to this in a bit, like in some of the subsequent stuff we're going to talk about, but I just think people need to conceive themselves as having a set of politics that's prior to their being a lawyer, or to their being a banker, or to their being a security guard, or to being a cleaner. It's like I really think that's important, because otherwise we get stuck on this elitism. And honestly, like, I've tried to organize lawyers through the trade union, and one of the big problems is a lot of lawyers conceive of themselves as something other than a worker. Like, they think of themselves as these floating elite intellectuals who help people. It's extremely patronizing, and that's just not a politics I want to have anything to do with. Like, I don't think I'm better than my fellow human. I think we enter into a dialogue together about the problematic nature of reality. I'm obviously channeling directly Freire here, right? We enter into a dialogue and we try to understand each other's problems together, and then we enter into a coalition to abolish the present state of things and to overthrow the forces that are dominating us. And in particular, that means imperial capitalism. So I mean it when I say we're all lawyers, but some of us are qualified. I think that the correct approach is to be extremely embedded in the movement. And I'm influenced here by Gramsci's thinking on organic intellectuals. We should consciously ask ourselves, what does it mean for us to be organic to the working class as it struggles against capitalism? What does it mean for us to be organic to the Palestinian people as they struggle against Zionism? And I hope it's not overly rhetorical. I said this outside Westminster Magistrates Court when I was asked to speak along with a large number of people whenever Liam from NECAP, right, Irish Republican rap trio, he was being charged, and there was a big rally outside the court. And I said, like, I think this rally that I really love, this chant that I really love, right, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. But there's this risk of kind of fetishizing Palestinians and making a claim that's not really true. It's like, am I Palestinian? No, I'm not being murdered because I'm not Jewish. That's a fate that befalls Palestinians. And it would be wrong to pretend that I'm the same as them. But what's good about the chant is that really what's being said is, it's not that we're all Palestinians, it's that Palestinians are all human, despite what Zionists try to have us believe, despite Yoav Gallant, former defense minister, saying that they're human animals. We disagree. We recognize their humanity, and solidarity means stepping into the breach with them, and it means escalating. So I think to be an anti-imperialist or an anti-Zionist, a socialist lawyer at this moment means many things in many different contexts. There's many different struggles, but the urgent struggle against the Zionist genocide, we need to escalate. And that's true of everyone, not just lawyers. Like, we need to urgently escalate, do it in a way that's collective, and do it now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing about that chant is to think about, what does it require of us, right? Like, what would it actually mean to take up that mantle, and what kind of sacrifices and collective risks are we willing to take to be worthy? Again, not like in a moralistic sense, but just in terms of joining up with humanity, around the cause of Palestine. And how central it is. I mean, I think one of the things, like, Max Isle has really helped me with my thinking around this, but just really understanding the importance of Palestine to the entire world system as it is currently constructed, right? And the importance, and that this is why the Zionists and the imperialists. It's why the imperialists are so willing to go so far down this road of bringing in these Zionist laws and going so over the top with their repression and so on, because obviously they don't like to do that. It provokes its own challenges and crises, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little bit more. But it must do it in order to defend itself, defend its system. And so we have to think dialectically in response to that of, okay, well, then what do we have to do in order to actually defend something like this, meaning defend Palestine against this kind of genocide and fight for a free Palestine. So I'm going to step into a space that I know there's some limitations on what you can say, partly because of laws within the UK and what they allow folks, the so-called UK, to talk about. And also because of, we're going to talk a little bit about prescription lists, which in the United States, our laws are a little bit different around this, but we do have, within war on terror legislation and everything else, a kind of similar thing of organizations getting designated as terrorists. And, folks shouldn't take anything that I say to constitute, legal advice or anything like that around it. They should understand this within their own context. But in the UK, recently, obviously, we've seen that Palestine Action, right, which is a direct action organization, has been prescribed, right? It is a crime, or is, I shouldn't say it's a crime. It's being prosecuted for people to say things like, I support Palestine Action in that context, and so on. And by the way, I should say we've had Huda Amori and other folks from Palestine Action on the show before over the years, and I'll link some of those conversations so that people can hear about the work that they've been engaged in or were engaged in up until this prescription. In the US context, we get more of a kind of we have a more of a language related to material support, which is also limits all kinds of things. It means that people can't send money to a lot of different, there's the whole case of the Holy Land Five in the United States, for instance, of them supporting groups in Palestine and people connecting this and say, oh, you're supporting prescribed terror organizations through this and so on. But there's definitely an effort underway in the United States, some through laws and some through terms of service and so on, to kind of broaden this definition more and more, to say that we can't do things ideologically or vocally to support organizations that are prescribed as terrorists, but we don't have as much law around that as it seems that you have in the UK, or as it's not as like codified within federal law or something like that. But in both of our countries, obviously, or the countries that we both reside in, they have a lot of authority to undermine national liberation struggles through these means, struggles against imperialism, and obviously solidarity with those struggles through these means. And so I'd love to hear some of your analysis on this and the importance of lawyers struggling in this realm. I note that you can't talk about the case for Hamas's de-prescription, but that is something else that folks can look into. But yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And if people want to look into that specific case, they can go to hamascase.com, where the pleadings are all available. But yeah, I'm not in a position to specifically talk about that today. That situation may change in future. But I mean, it's a great question. It's an important question, and I do think that, again, it's almost like coming full circle, right? I said I came to London with these slightly parochial Irish Republican politics, and then I stepped into a broader universalism. But I'm now going to sort of step back into the particularity of the British colonial project, because I think it's important to think through the history of these laws and the fact that they came specifically from the Irish context, right? So they emerged in the 1970s in the context of hundreds of years of British colonialism in Ireland, because the remaining 6 counties are they're in crisis, right? And we can do a sort of whistle-stop history. Like 1969 is whenever the British Army gets reintroduced to the north of Ireland, and you have the burning of Catholic estates, in particular the Ardoyne estate, right? So Catholics are being burned out of their homes by something that looks in some ways very similar to Zionism, right? This kind of settler colonial ideology, this belief that Catholics are kind of racially inferior, and that the statelet, the colonial project of the north of Ireland, exists for Protestants and not for Catholics. And the state itself has been gerrymandered to exclude Catholics, to exclude Catholic population, and it consistently returns Protestant elected officials because of the way that the electoral boundaries have been drawn, because of the way that the franchise works, right? People who own property were allowed to vote multiple times, that kind of thing. So it's a staged, managed kind of colonial project, and there's an obvious response to that. There's an anti-colonial response to that, and groups like the Irish Republican Army, Provisional Irish Republican Army, and the Irish National Liberation Army emerged to fight it. So the British state has this problem. 1971, it tries to respond to the problem. So sort of 2 years into broadly what's called the Troubles, they enact this internment policy where it's like internment is what you do during a war. You intern enemy combatants, right? And then they're detained pursuant to the Geneva Conventions, right? And they become prisoners of war, right? So without declaring that they were at war with the IRA and other groups, the British state just lifts more than 1,000 people out of their homes, out of their lives, doesn't charge them with any crime, just says you're in an internment camp now, right? And in the context of the north of Ireland, that's a lot of people, right? Like north of Ireland today is about 1.5 million people, right? So 1,000 people is this massive chunk of the Catholic population is just being shoved into an internment camp because the British state doesn't know what to do about the increasingly sophisticated Irish Republican struggle that they're faced with. And then 1972 is Bloody Sunday, right? So you have this peaceful, kind of inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King, these marches. NICRO was the big group, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and it's a march for civil rights in 1972 in the city of Derry in the north of Ireland that's attacked by the British Army, paratroop regiment, and they massacre 14 people with machine guns, right? And that leads to this massive increase in support for the so-called physical force tradition. And because it's just obvious, right? If you're like a young Catholic person growing up in the north of Ireland, 17, 18, like lots of energy and militant and all the rest of it. I don't want to make assumptions about young people, but the point is, you know, you see this peaceful campaign for Catholics to be treated equally being violently murdered by machine guns. A lot of people are going to respond to that by saying, okay, I guess we have to fight back, right? So 1972 leads to a massive increase in support for the Irish Republican tradition. And so the British state tries to contain this anti-colonial struggle. And one of the ways it does that is by trying to withdraw the POW status. It wasn't called POW status, it was called special category status, but they try to withdraw it because they see that they've bestowed a legitimacy on their enemies, right? Their enemies are able to say, right, we're in an army and we're in a POW camp, and I'm not going to wear a prison uniform, I'm not going to do prison work. There's all of these rights that come to them from the Geneva Convention. And so the British state tries to withdraw special category status. That leads to the blanket protest, because the Irish Republican prisoners refused to wear prison uniforms, and that meant that they were denied the right to go to the toilet. So they're having to go to the toilet in their own cells, hence the dirty protest. And the blanket protest is because they wore blankets because they weren't given any clothes, right? Because they refused to wear prison uniforms. That's 1976. And then fast forward to 1980. 1980 is the first abortive attempt at a hunger strike. And then 1981 is the infamous hunger strike led by Bobby Sands, in which 10 men succumbed to their hunger strike, 3 from the Irish National Liberation Army and 7 from the Provisional IRA. And of course, Bobby Sands famously elected to Parliament before his death, and sort of runs a coach and horses through the British state's policy of trying to criminalize Irish republicanism, right? So you think about how they actually criminalized it. It was to create this emergency legislation, so-called emergency legislation, that then gets renewed every 6 months for the entire duration of the Troubles. And that's always the way with emergency legislation, right? Like, oh, we just need these powers because it's an emergency, and then they get addicted to using the power and they codify it. So they come across, they light upon this technique where they can say, oh, the Provisional IRA is now an illegal organization, it's prescribed, and if you're a member, that is a criminal offense, right? And then various other criminal offenses kick in as well, right? So that's where the technique comes from. And then Tony Blair comes along and he gets some credit for being a kind of peacemaker. He presides over the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, so-called Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Treaty. And that leads to Irish Republican groups, most of them, agreeing to lay down their arms. And then 2 years later, his government passes the Terrorism Act 2000. So that was a codification of the technique that they had applied in the north of Ireland, and they make it international. And then a year later, they add something like 20 groups to the list, including the military wing of Hamas, right? So I think we learned something about that history. It's important for us to understand the history of where that comes from. And I mean, I suppose the obvious thing to say about this terrorism legislation is that it's just deliberately political. It's designed to politicize the criminal law. Obviously, everything is political in some general sense, but like it's designed, like when you think about what's being charged under terrorism offenses, it's like the things, for example, that the Palestine Action direct actionists are accused of, they're all already crimes, right? So the British state could just say, all right, you've gone into an arms factory and you've caused a bunch of damage. We have a crime for that. It's called criminal damage. And up until the attempt to prescribe, that was broadly what they were doing. But I think in some ways it's a badge of honor that the British state is so perturbed by the rise of the Palestinian movement that it's having to resort to these increasingly draconian mechanisms. So I sometimes think I'm too optimistic and too voluntaristic. That's why sometimes I lapse into saying, like, it's a terminal crisis of Zionism. But when I catch myself and I'm being disciplined, I say, no, like, we don't know what's going to happen. We must pursue a strategy aimed at the systematic destruction and dismantling of Zionism. And so in a similar vein, I think there's a risk of being complacent. Like, I feel quite hopeful, but specifically about Palestine Action and this kind of Streisand effect, right? Like, you saw it with Kneecap. As I understand it, Streisand effect is like what she had a picture of her home and she didn't want it to go viral, so she tried to suppress it. And then the fact of her trying to suppress it is what made it go viral. So we see that with Bob Villain and Kneecap, right? Kneecap, like they were known in my circles, like people, comrades on the British left, like, oh, have you heard about these amazing lads who rap in, Asquilga and don't like the British Army and don't like the police. But the attempt to suppress them, right? There was that, they had that banner in Coachella, whatever, and then, oh, we're going to revoke the visas, whatever. And it just makes them look cool AF. Like, it's just a mistake by our enemies to try and suppress people like that. It increases their platform. And then we had this hilarious episode with the BBC, outraged that they were playing Glastonbury. So they said, right, we're not going to cover them. Let someone else have the coverage. And there's someone else is Bob Villain. And Bob Villain chants death, death to the IDF live to like millions of viewers. And then they try and do the same thing. They're like, we're going to suppress this guy. And now his career, like their career, I should say, it's a band, isn't it? They've just completely taken off. So that's why I'm hopeful about Palestine Action. It's obviously different. It's going beyond artistic interventions, and it's directly confronting the weaponry of war. I do think we mustn't be complacent. I think about the way that the American left was smashed, not just in the McCarthy era, but really in the 1920s, right? Think about Eugene Debs running from prison, right? Like the American left was smashed and it's never really recovered. So we can't be complacent. We can't be like, oh, they're trying to smash Palestine Action, but it's okay. We're going, the Streisand effect will just kick in and we'll win. It's like, no, like we need to fight back and we need to make sure that they may try to make an individual group illegal, and there's a struggle against that in the courts and in the streets and in the formal political process, and it seems possible that that ban can be defeated in that way. But even if the ban remains in place, the correct strategy remains escalation. Like they can't ban a tactic and they can't stop us from escalating unless we let them stop us, right? And I don't know if this is overly playful, but I'm really moved by this Hegelian idea of like master slave. And I know, again, Paulo Freire talks about it. I'm sort of a Paulo Freire stan. Like, I just love that book. But Hegel talks about master slave. In the master slave dynamic, the person with the real power is the so-called slave, because they're the ones who can refuse domination and provoke the reckoning, right? The reemergence of both parties' humanity, right? So when people try and dominate us, people try and dominate Palestine Action, like we can just refuse, and that's what's so incredible, and it's horrific, but it's so incredible and inspiring about the Palestinian people, right? It's like they're dominated for more than a century. They're told you're subhuman, you know, there's no people in this land, you're not human, and here they are 100 years later just spitting in the face of their enemies and saying, like, you can kill us, but you'll never dominate us. Like, it's beautiful, and it's the only way to live. Like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna let fascism win? You're going to let your enemies dominate you? Like, no, we just have to keep grounding ourselves in our humanity and our love for our fellow humans. And I don't know if I'm straying slightly beyond the question about prescription regimes, but I think linking it back to that, like as I said outside, I was invited to speak outside the High Court whenever the ban was about to come into effect. And there was this last minute attempt at a legal challenge seeking interim relief, right? Like staying the coming into effect of the ban while the legal challenge ran its course. And disappointing result, obviously. The judges, I think, behaved in quite a cowardly and unprincipled fashion, but it's continuing. The legal challenge continues. But what I said outside the court to this, again, very like hopeful, militant crowd of anti-Zionist comrades, like I don't think they're powerful enough to stop us. I think that the reason that they're having to deploy the already extremely blunt instrument of the Terrorism Act 2000 to a direct action group like Palestine Action is because they're pathetic and weak, and the people of even a country like Britain have turned decisively against Zionism, and so they're making all of these strategic blunders and making themselves look ridiculous and authoritarian because they don't have any answer. Like, everyone hates Zionism, everyone hates Keir Starmer, everyone is extremely angry about the participation of the British Empire in this genocide, and it looks like there's going to be a political reckoning. Like, with the critical support for the emergence of this interesting new Corbyn Sultana left-wing party, if the left is sufficiently organized, if we're capable of overcoming some of our disagreements and pursuing a valid strategy, it could be the case that there's a kind of political revolution in 2029 when the general election happens, and the Labour Party will just be completely crushed by the pressure from both the right and the left. So, inshallah, as they say.
Indeed, yeah. I know we got to get you out of here in a couple minutes. So as we kind of close, maybe we could kind of combine a couple of these last questions and you could give brief summaries to them. So one was like, obviously, a lot of people are facing legal consequences or, you know, losing their jobs or whatever, for supporting Palestine and opposing this horrific genocide in Gaza. One, how should they understand the meaning of those consequences? And then in addition to that, what are your message to kind of lawyers who are around the world who have kind of awakened to this horror, but have not yet gotten involved in supporting the folks facing those legal consequences, or losing their livelihoods or so on, related to their support for Palestine and their opposition, or opposing the genocide?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think that I said I was in Berlin recently, and they have it in some ways much worse than in Britain. And there's all this Staatsräson stuff, like the reason of state. And so the German state, part of its reason is to support the existence of a Jewish state or whatever. And so that just shows in this very mechanical, liberal, mechanistic way how the crisis of Zionism is a crisis for the German state on its own terms, right? They say our reason of state is to support this entity, and the entity's in crisis. So that has this knock-on effect on Germany, right? So I was in that context where I think people were, they were feeling quite deflated. There was a Palestinian comrade there, right, Heba Jamal, who was facilitating the discussion, and she understandably just feels like, well, I think all the comrades there just feel like really beaten into a corner by the sheer violence of the German police, all the rest of it. And one of the guys asked a question about professional consequences, because I was articulating this very kind of militant, like we should go into court, we should cause maximum damage. I was showing examples of how I was trying to do that, and then this guy just said, well, he was a practicing lawyer, and he said, how do you keep it so that your arguments are admissible? Do you ever face personal consequences? Like we were talking about regulators. Do you ever get dragged in front of your regulators? So I think my main message to anyone who's not in Palestine right now is like the stakes for you are so low. I don't want to generalize too much, but broadly speaking, right? I'm sure that there are racialized people and stuff for whom the stakes are higher. But broadly, if you're in the diaspora, certainly if you're a white guy with a European passport and you're practicing as a lawyer, like the stakes for you are almost nothing. Like say you do get dragged in front of your regulator, say you do more public-facing stuff, or say you go into argument and make a disruptive anti-Zionist arguments, and someone tries to report you to your regulator, like, okay, but what's that next to a genocide? Like sincerely, what's that next to a genocide? I just don't think the stakes are that high, and I think that there has been, I quoted it on Twitter, like from Alana's latest book, Alana Lenton's book, The New Racial Regime, and she was quoting a thinker who was talking about intellectual timidity and like a lack of substance and all the rest of it. Like that applies to a lot of these qualified lawyers, right? So that's one thing I would say is like, come on, like put it in perspective. It's a genocide, right? I was in that Electronic Intifada interview, I was talking about dying on the hill. So you're not being asked to die on the hill. Palestinians are dying on the hill. Like you are just being asked to do something more in solidarity with them. That we should stop acting as if the stakes for us are quite so high, right? And I say that obviously with the caveat that, like, there's political prisoners in this country who've gone to prison for trying to show solidarity with Palestinians, right? So there are risks you can take, right? If you want to go and start smashing up arms factories and saying that it's necessary to do that to prevent a genocide, and therefore it's not criminal. If you want to go in front of a jury and say that, like, these are all things that are open to you, right? We're radically free, as Sartre would say, to escalate our opposition to the genocide. I do think we have to do that collectively. I think that doing it through your trade union, doing it through revolutionary organizations, that's really important. And I also think that, I said before, like I'm a communist first, lawyer second. Like whatever your politics are, join a revolutionary organization or join an organization that speaks to your politics and try to articulate your struggle in a more collective way. It's a big problem, certainly at the bar. The bar is full of self-employed people, right? The independent bar. And that's part of what's good about it, because an individual guy can just say, or a person, a barrister can just say, right, you know what, I'm going to take this case and no one can stop me because I'm self-employed. So that's the good side of it. But the bad side of it is this kind of hyper individualism, right? Like we need to pose this question collectively, because Zionism will be defeated as part of a coalition that storms the Zionist entity and tears it to the ground, right? So again, my message would be like, let's think this through collectively and let's find ways collectively to escalate. And I suppose to qualified lawyers, it's not just defensive. I think there has been a decisive shift. Zionism is so weak that we need to go on the offensive. And so absolutely that defense work needs to continue happening. In particular, criminal defense work, right? We need more principled lawyers. So it's a capacity issue. And that relates to what I said about it being collective. We need to build more institutions that are capable of increasing the number of qualified lawyers, but we also need to do, training and public-facing training where we say this is what it means to go into court and do maximum damage to Zionism. But ultimately, the terrain is shifting under the feet of everyone. And the time is now to go on the offensive, in my opinion. And that means not just defending yourself against cases, but finding vulnerable targets and suing them, bringing proactive legal action against them. I can't stress enough, it needs to be that you have a prior political strategy and you subordinate any such legal tactics to that prior strategy. But once you've duly put in place that strategy, my main message is go into court and consciously cause maximum damage to Zionism. Just, if nothing else, go into court and try to find a way of saying that your purpose in being there, your client's purpose in being there, is to do maximum damage to the fascist ideology of Zionism. And in a country like Britain, a country like United States, a country like Germany, that includes going in and without moralism, without too much kind of passion, because in Britain, the courts frown on being too animated in court. You're supposed to sound like you're sort of bored by what you're saying, but you can just go in and say, the British state is responsible for this genocide. It is actively participating in this genocide. The British state has lost all moral and political legitimacy because it is currently engaged in the mass murder of Palestinians because they are not Jewish and as such viewed as a racial threat to the British colonial project of creating a little loyal Jewish Ulster. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, just escalate, do it urgently, do it collectively. And if you're a qualified lawyer, go into court, tell the court that that's what you're doing, and consciously cause as much damage as you can to the fascist ideology of Zionism.
Frank, much appreciated. I know that you have much important work to get to, so I'm gonna let you ease out. But this has been wonderful. Appreciate it. Look forward to hopefully some future discussions, and maybe, at a later date too, we can talk about some of the cases that you're not able to talk about right now. Is there anything else that you wanted to share or say before we let you go?
Just to thank you so much for the great work that you're doing. Like you say that I'm busy, like we're all busy. We're all out here doing our best to struggle against Zionism, to struggle against the totality of capitalist class relations that has allowed this genocide to happen. And, it is horrific, but we're going to win. The Palestinians are going to win because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about, right? The alternative is that fascism succeeds. And like, there's a hope. Like I feel weirdly relieved to know that I'll die before I tolerate that outcome. I don't want to live in a world where the fascists win, so I will live and die fighting them. And it's been a real pleasure and an honor to share this space with you, man. Like, you're all doing vital work, and I hope we get a chance to revisit this conversation at some point in the future.
Absolutely. The pleasure is mine as well, mutually, and I look forward to that. We'll make sure to follow back up down the road, and keep up the good work. Really appreciate what you're doing, and thanks for sharing so much of your thinking around it, your analysis, and so on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. See you soon, comrade.
All right, see you soon. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap us up there. That was great. Much appreciation to Frank Magennis, and do check out that Electronic Intifada interview if you missed it for whatever reason. On Monday, we're going to have Abdul Jawad Omar back again to do another one of our, analyses, plus talk about some of the theoretical work that he's been writing recently. And I'm sure much more. Tomorrow, I might do like a live stream just on the Lifeline for Gaza, kind of mutual aid work that folks are doing with Chuff's campaigns and GoFundMe's, which there's a cool tool that's been created that I kind of want to highlight and talk about. And it also shows that there's a lot of people in Gaza who have not received a single dollar in the last 5+ days, at least 5 days. And obviously they just, we're talking about starvation, and there is actually some food getting into the markets right now, but they don't have any money to buy it. Right. And so it's really important that we support folks in that way and continue to boost those campaigns and support those campaigns. So, all right, folks, I'm going to get us out of here on that note. I'm going to add also some stuff to the show description, some of the references that Frank made, and so people can see that stuff as well. All right, have a good one.